Hello, everybody. It's April 22nd, 2023, and tonight I'm going to review John A. Macdonald, The Young Politician by Donald Creighton. Let's get a good up close of that first. I think hopefully people can see it up here. Yeah, that's got it. So, this is a two-volume uh, combination of The Young Politician and the second volume, The Old Chieftain, biography of John A. Macdonald, Prime Minister of Canada, um, the first Prime Minister of Canada after Confederation, but he was in public office for many years before that, and obviously has become controversial in recent years, but to me, I'm just going to focus on this book. I'm not going to engage too much in anything else beyond the text of this book, although I will add some other, uh, minor sources to as commentary on Creigton's um, magisterial tome. So, starting with the foreword, this biography, The Young Politician, was originally published 1952. This is a 1998 edition. There's a foreword by the Sir John A. Macdonald Historical Society. It says, in the months leading up to the celebration of Canada's centennial year, 1967, many Canadians became involved in planning various centennial projects. One group of British Columbians, inspired by the leadership of Sir John in the founding of Canada, decided to commemorate him by founding the Sir John A. Macdonald Historical Society. Appropriate being in Vancouver as I am, that this was the case. Since then, the Society has tried to stimulate the pride of Canadians in their identity. It has sponsored various speakers and sent its own energetic members across the country to communicate Sir John's concept of the equality and partnership of Canada. With the help of generous donors, the Society bestowed a statue of Sir John on the city of Victoria. That's featured on the back of this volume. Hopefully people can see that. For a number of years, the Society has also sponsored the award-winning Sir John A. Macdonald Society Pipe Band. Now, through a special contribution of this book, the Society hopes to acquaint every high school student in British Columbia with the fascinating story of the early years of this country from the perspective of its first Prime Minister. That's written, the foreword written by the Sir John A. Macdonald Historical Society. The introduction is by P.B. Waite, who appears to have been a grad student of Creigton's at U of T, apparently in the 1940s. Now, Creigton is a scholar of the old school. University of Toronto, educated in England. I'll just make a few quotes from the introduction. Half a century ago, the history department at the University of Toronto inhabited a spacious old house at the corner of St. George and College Streets that once belonged to Robert Baldwin. Ooh, to Robert Baldwin, of Baldwin and LaFontaine fame, which is sort of the generation or older politicians when John A was coming up. So the history department occupied a house that once belonged to Robert Baldwin, the reformed politician of the 1840s and 50s. Hence, it was called Baldwin House. In 1950-51, in a large west room on the ground floor, for 2 hours, Donald Creighton held his weekly seminar in Canadian history, 1840 to 1900. There were a dozen grad students there that year, some of them war veterans from several universities: Dalhousie, University of New Brunswick, Queen's, Manitoba, UBC, as well as Toronto. The topic for discussion one January afternoon in 1951 was the Pacific Scandal, with a paper given by an MA student from Western Canada. The paper was not all that good, a slapdash affair grubbed up from secondary sources. In our experience, it says, Creigton, long, lean, and pensive, presided at the head of the table. In our experience, he had always been fair. That he had opinions we knew, but he rarely obtruded them. He seemed to be after what had really happened. He neither wanted nor expected conformity with his own views. So he did not ride roughshod over student papers, bullying as Chester Martin, head of the department from 1928 to 1952, was wont to do. Creigton expected evidence and taught us to do so also. You could tell him anything if you could prove it from the documents. He wanted you to reach for the truth, whatever that might be, but he did expect you to make the effort of reaching. Now, however, after 15 minutes, it was all too patent from this Pacific Scandal paper that this Pacific Scandal paper was thin and the effort put into it negligible. Creigton raised his hand. Ooh, boy. Quote, "I think," he said coolly and politely, "that we shall have to tidy this up a little," unquote. Creigton had never done this before. We sat silent, a little abashed. We soon forgot our discomfort, however, and Creigton made no further mention of the matter. We soon forgot even the winter afternoon closing in outside. Creigton began to weave, there is no better word for it, the story of the Pacific Scandal, the railway negotiations, the struggle between Montreal and Toronto over CPR control, the blackmail once the Americans got themselves in, how the Liberals bribed the clerk in J.J. Abbott's Montreal office, how he stole in and got at the files, pulled out the incriminating letters, and sidled out into the Montreal night, how they were published in the newspaper July 1873, and how Macdonald handled the whole messy affair not all that well. We were on the edge of our seats. Creigton was like a sorcerer around a campfire telling the story of a great adventure. He was enjoying himself. Finally, at 6:10 p.m., Macdonald having resigned with his government in ruins, Creigton stopped. Quote, "That, gentlemen," said he, "is a Pacific Scandal." We burst into applause. Most of us had never heard anything like it before. Some of us have heard nothing like it since. It was a bravura performance. We knew it and he knew it. He was moved by our demonstration, though he tried not to let that show. We stood around talking admiringly as he left, then slowly dispersed to our several lodgings across the big Toronto campus through the gathering winter night. Donald Creighton came from a literary family, the son of Laura Harvey and William Black Creigton, editor of the Methodist Christian Guardian. Born in Toronto, July 15, 1902, he was brought up in a modest home on Hewitt Avenue, just east of High Park, and went to Humberside Collegiate. He then took honors English and history at Victoria College, where he graduated in 1925. He went on to Balliol College, Oxford, in the autumn of 1925 on a scholarship, feeling very much the colonial in accent, style, clothing, manners, and money. He was a product of the Methodist Toronto of the 1920s, a narrow and earnest society, though in its decidedly bourgeois way it tried to be civilized. In some ways it was. Its high school education was still solid. At Humberside College, Creigton had learnt by heart a good deal of English poetry. He had an extraordinary knowledge of and memory for poetry. He was well read in English literature and in French, as he believed scholars should be. He was difficult to beat in that game, I'm quoting poetry. Over drinks and friendship, one added, if one could, to the first line of a poem the next, or even the rest of the stanza. At Oxford, Creigton read little in the constitutional history of the British Empire, often the heartland for Canadian students as the only historical ground that touched on Canada. Instead, he read mainly European and British history and slowly gathered around him like a cloak the great traditions of European civilization. This is Creigton. He returned to Toronto from his education, and in Toronto he would remain to the end of his life, save for the odd research trip abroad. He was made assistant professor at U of T in 1932, associate in 1939, and top rank in 1945. So Creigton's definitely one of the old school U of T Canadian historians, and one of the most prominent. So getting into the text of the young politician, he dedicates this to Harold Adams Innes, who seems to be ubiquitous in the books that I was reviewing. The first book I reviewed by Knorr, he had Harold Innes do the introduction, and here Creigton dedicates this book to Harold Adams Innes. So Macdonald was born in 1815 in Scotland. His family, which consisted of his parents and 4 kids, including himself, arrived in Kingston, Upper Canada, in 1815, or in 1820, when he was 5 years old. His father, well, Creigton suggests that Macdonald's mother planned to recoup failures of her husband through her sole surviving son. That's John Alexander. Macdonald's father, I won't go into too much or characterize him too much, because I don't want to mischaracterize him, but just a few facts. He failed at several business enterprises that he tried to start, and so he was not a big businessman. He had a few smaller businesses that he tried to start, and they failed, or most of them, or possibly all of them. And so this is the context in which Creigton makes that comment about his mother wanting to recoup failures of her husband through her sole surviving son. So John A. was away for school from age 10 in Kingston when his family was living at Stone Mills to the west. So he left home by age 10 to a school in Kingston, and his family was to the west of Kingston. He wasn't commuting to Kingston. He lived away from his family starting age 10. He went to a school where he was well grounded in Latin, was taught French, but his French was apparently not that good, but he was certainly taught French. Um, the school he went to was operated by the Reverend John Cruikshank, who was educated at the Scottish universities. The school had 20 to 25 children aged 6 to 16. As one-room school houses, in rural parts of Canada, tended to have multiple grades in it. This was the case here. Few of his fellow students, by coincidence, turned out to be famous people like himself. Oliver Mowat, who became Premier of Ontario, I believe, was also in this small schoolroom. And John Hilliard Cameron, who became Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada or Ontario after Confederation, I'm not sure. His last day of education, he left Cruikshank's school / shop, must have been both a school and a shop, aged 14. Such was the standard of the day, only few got to go higher. So at age 15, he began articling as a law student, age 15. But first he had to pass his law examination at York. The law examination consisted of a passage of Latin to translate, a little Latin parsing, some math propositions, a few history questions. John A. used to sing in a small church choir in Napanee. This is, I think, right after he started as a law articling. But right at the beginning, uh, when he was articling, his employer and mentor, George Mackenzie, died of Asiatic cholera. This is when John A. was 19 years old. So he was familiar right from that age with tragedy. That's age 19. His employer and mentor died. He had a sense of humor from a young age, sardonic, burlesque. Him and some of the young men formed a mock society called the Société de la Vache Rouge, which was mocking revolutionary, or the name had it was mocking revolutionary undertones in both provinces after the general election of 1834. He attended St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, Kingston, the denominational equivalent of the Church of England, like for Scotland, and had a co-equal legal status with the Church of England per Act of Union 1707. Church of Scotland. He imbibed its worldview. In the summer of 1835, he opened his own law practice, aged 20. Opened his own law practice. This was the standard of the time. He said later at some point, he says that he started working for his living at age 15, but that he didn't think that was anything special. He was neither Enlightenment influenced nor evangelical, or the church was neither Enlightenment influenced nor evangelical. He was part of social societies this is in Kingston, of course. The Celtic Society, he was part of, like more politically powerful Orange Order, included all British groups vis-a-vis French and American. John A. was the Celtic Society's recording secretary. He was influenced by the conservative British Defence Against Canadian Reform and Rebellion, the rebellions of 1837, 1838. So he was influenced by the defense of uh, of the government in the 1837, 1838 rebellions. Now, I've got a bunch of quotes from this period right before the rebellions. So this will take us into the world of the time. On Wednesday morning, December 6th, 1837, in the midst of this satisfied calm, the regular stagecoach from the west, which had left Toronto on Sunday, arrived in Kingston. It bore alarming news, all the more alarming since it was 3 days old. The Radicals, so the report ran, had been seen drilling in large numbers to the north of Toronto. An attack on the city had been feared on the previous Saturday, and it was expected that on Monday the Lieutenant Governor would issue a proclamation calling up the militia for duty. All day the news spread, all day the town awaited anxiously, and the early December dark was already falling when another stage, an express direct from Toronto, clattered down Store Street to the post office. This time the news was both definite and stupendous. The rebels, to the number of about 400, had assembled with arms within a few miles of Toronto, and an attack on the capital was hourly expected. Now, in peaceful Upper Canada, the revolt had broken out. That night, only an hour or so after the stage had brought the tidings of the rebellion, the magistrates called a meeting of the citizens at the courthouse. The regular troops had left for Lower Canada. Apart from a few small detachments of Royal Artillery and Royal Engineers, there were no Imperial soldiers in Kingston, and there, as elsewhere in the province, it was the plain citizens who rushed together in a great spontaneous movement to improvise their own defense. On the first night, in a strange atmosphere of ignorance and worry and excitement, only the sketchiest arrangements could be made. The town was divided into wards for protective purposes. The townsmen were hurriedly enrolled and armed, and all night long stout patrols, each headed by a magistrate, tramped through the echoing streets. The next morning, Thursday, the steamboat Traveller arrived from Toronto, bringing the welcome news that the Gore militia had landed at the capital the day before, and the rapidly growing citizen army would probably soon take the offensive against the rebels. But the first duty of Kingston, Frontenac County, and the Midland District generally was to defend Fort Henry and the naval base, and to secure the eastern part of the province. Actually, there was no danger east of Toronto, and at Toronto itself, on the day before the Traveller returned with its consignment of arms, the little amateur army of farmers, mechanics, and professional men which had gathered at the capital marched north up Yonge Street and easily scattered Mackenzie's dwindling forces. But in those first excited, bewildered days, precise news came slowly, and vague rumors spread with incredible rapidity, and rebellion, which had not been seriously feared even at Toronto, was now expected almost anywhere and everywhere in the province. Macdonald was, of course, a member of the sedentary militia, capital S, capital M. Every able-bodied male in the province between the ages of 18 and 60 was, by law at least, a member of the sedentary militia. It was a vast, cumbrous, and in many ways a comically inefficient organization, which existed not so much to give the population an adequate military training, there was neither time nor money for that, as to acquaint the inhabitants with their responsibilities for the defense of the province and to muster them swiftly in times of actual danger. Kingston was proud of its hastily collected amateur army of over 500 men, and the loyal ladies of the town, meeting at Mrs. Harper's at the Commercial Bank, quickly raised £44 to buy a set of colours for their husbands and sons in the Frontenac militia. Macdonald shouldered his musket with the rest. His professional friends, his cronies in the Young Men's Society, his relations, and his fellow members of St. Andrew's Church were prominent in Kingston's citizen army. Some of them were as officers. Macdonald himself was considered for promotion when a new regiment The 3rd or East Frontenac Regiment was formed in the following month, January 1838. His name, with that of one of his best friends, Charles Stewart, immediately below, headed the list of those who were recommended as ensigns in the new regiment. In the end, his appointment did not take place for reasons which are unknown, but it is possible that Macdonald may have pleaded his responsibilities, a virtual householder with a large family dependent upon him. I think he was sending money back to his mother, and I don't know if his father was still alive at this point, but his brothers and sisters, or his sisters, may have pleaded his responsibilities as an excuse for the additional duty. In any event, he and fellow privates and officers had comparatively little to do. There was no doubt some drill and target practice, some marching and counter-marching, and long afterward Macdonald remembered vividly one grueling march in which, though weary with the weight of his heavy musket, he had managed to keep up with his companion, quote, a grim old soldier who seemed impervious to fatigue, unquote. But there was no fighting whatever, for the whole eastern part of the province was tranquilly loyal. West of Toronto, the disturbances continued for a little while longer, and there was some rather officious rebel hunting, but in effect the rebellion collapsed on December 7th in the little skirmish on Yonge Street. Within a week, the people of Upper Canada, by their own efforts and without the slightest professional military assistance, had overwhelmed a small internal revolt. The teeny battle on Yonge Street and the flight of Mackenzie and a few other fugitives across the border sufficed to rouse, in the northern United States, a mass of uninformed, credulous, and violently anti-British opinion. So this little rebellion is spreading a little bit, which for a year kept the international boundary in a state of actual or threatened violence. That's obviously more serious than the small rebellion at Toronto. Inspired by the impulse to liberate the oppressed Canadians, to assist a republican movement which had scarcely ever had any real existence, large bodies of American citizens periodically assembled and armed themselves with little or no concealment for the invasion of Canada. And on half a dozen occasions, while the military authorities of the northern states looked on with benevolent detachment, and while a few zealous American federal officers and a handful of federal troops struggled vainly to preserve their country's neutrality, these American sympathizers, these pirates or bandits as the Canadians called them, actually succeeded in carrying out raids on Canadian territory. The quote rebellion as a native uprising had lasted only a matter of days. Now it threatened to continue indefinitely as an undeclared guerrilla war with the citizens of the northern United States. The citizens of Kingston were not at first directly affected by these excitements on the frontier, for the first phase of the quote pirate bases was established during December 1837 and January 1838 on Navy Island in the Niagara River, so way up on the other end of Lake Ontario. But in February, the danger began to spread eastward towards the St. Lawrence River, directly threatening Kingston. During the third week of February 1838, startling reports of the pillage of the Watertown arsenal of, quote, bandit assemblies and drilling began to filter into town. And on February 22nd, what more appropriate day for the enterprise could have been chosen than Washington's birthday, the quote sympathizers began to gather at the mouth of French Creek, a stream flowing into the St. Lawrence from the American side, nearly opposite to Gananoque. The Kingston garrison of British regulars had not yet returned, and once again the town was dependent on its citizen army. So an invasion of Americans occurred. And for Macdonald and his generation, this was the first affair since the troubles in the Canadas had begun, which had brought with it any real prospect of fighting. The danger had come not from their own discontented fellow subjects, but from some bellicose citizens of northern New York State, and from then on the American sympathizer became the chief object of the baffled indignation of the Kingstonians. In March, when the first round of raids was over, and when a great crowd assembled one evening in the Kingston marketplace to hang and burn the enemies in effigy, The symbolic figure of the United States was singled out for special treatment. At 7 o'clock, 8 stuffed figures were strung up on a tall gallows before an amused and satisfied crowd of thousands. These are in effigy, these are not real people. It was a curious collection of criminals. The English philosophical radicals, Hume, Grote, Molesworth, Leader, and Roebuck, hung dangling beside the Canadian rebels, Mackenzie and Papineau. A special place outside the main gallows was given to Uncle Sam or Brother Jonathan the sympathizer. On May 17, 1838, it was one of the last sessions under Macdonald's presidency. The Young Men's Society met to debate the practical professional question, quote, how far is circumstantial evidence to be admitted as constituting satisfactory evidence, and what objections bear against the admission of circumstantial evidence generally? This is the kind of thing that they talked about at the Young Men's Society. In all this process of settlement, a young lawyer like Macdonald, with a small provincial practice, could expect to take only a very modest part in all the larger dramas of the rebellion and the government. But the great political trials, so he's referring to, he couldn't represent anybody too high level in the subsequent trials that occurred. But the great political trials were Toronto trials, monopolized by the lawyers of the capital, and the Midland District is what they called Kingston, which had been relatively so unaffected by the rebellion, produced only one important treason case during the busy judicial summer of 1838. Macdonald took the case, and took it this time alone. So he's defending people accused of treason. Okay. 8 men, residents apparently of Hastings and Lennox and Addington counties, were arraigned before Justice McLean in the first week of July. The case against them looked dark enough. Some of them have been caught with arms in their hands. Some had been persuaded or coerced by a vigorous officious magistrate to sign affidavits in which they had sworn to their guilt. And the Kingston townsfolk clearly expected a verdict of guilty. But there was a new spirit of clemency abroad, affecting both courts and juries. John S. Cartwright, who prosecuted for the Crown, allowed the prisoners a good deal of indulgence, and Macdonald's defense was skillful. How old is he at this point? He's only 23 years old. He's 23 years old, and he's defending 8 men accused of treason. I don't know what the possible punishment for treason was here, but the comprising affidavits were summarily rejected as an outrage upon the administration of justice. The witnesses for the Crown, under close cross-examination, broke down and began to contradict each other, and the prosecution failed to establish any deliberate continuity of purpose on the part of the accused. To the very last, the outcome was uncertain. On the 4th most important of the cases, the jury was out from Saturday afternoon till Monday evening. On the 4 most important cases. But at last it brought in a verdict of not guilty, and in the end all the prisoners were acquitted. One young man sitting in the court and watching the trial's climax with absorbed interest remembered Macdonald's, quote, marked triumph long afterwards, and a Kingston newspaper informed its readers that, quote, the prisoners were defended with much ingenuity and ability by Mr. J. A. Macdonald, who, though one of the youngest barristers in the province, is rapidly rising in his profession. So that's definitely a big first event in his professional career. There's a couple other cases here that are really interesting, worth relating and tell us a lot about him before he entered politics. This is why these anecdotes are important, because they kind of show us what his interest in character was before he got involved in politics. So John A. was influenced by the conservative British defense of the Upper Canadian system, you know, from the rebellions of 1837 1838. So we can gather there, although he defended guys accused of treason in the rebellion. So I'll let the viewer interpret from that something about his character at this early point in his life. So there's another case here that I think is important, and I'll get into it right now. I was going to mention it at the end, but from his early career, he also defended an Indigenous man accused of murder. And this is related in Don Smith's recent publication. This is 2021, I believe. 2021, Seen But Not Seen, Influential Canadians and the First Nations from the 1840s to today. So, and this is from 1839, so it's just 1 year later. Sir John A. Macdonald was 24 years old. So, quoting from Smith, in 1839, Macdonald, then 24 years old, represented a Tyendinaga Mohawk named Brant in a murder trial. John Culbertson acted as his Mohawk interpreter. In his cross-examination in the Kingston courtroom, the young lawyer cleverly extracted an important admission from the Crown's principal witness. The murder occurred in a darkened house when everyone was drunk, which made it impossible to be certain who held the knife used in the murder. The Kingston Chronicle newspaper described Macdonald's defense as, quote, ingenious. Although the jury ruled manslaughter, the judge only imposed a 6-month sentence on Brant. So this, now I should relate some other, I don't want to paint John or draw attention too much. Like, I'm not focusing on John A's relationship or lack thereof with the Indigenous peoples, for which he's been severely criticized recently, obviously, in the last, 5 years. But this instant, these two cases from his early law practice are, I'd have to say, quite conspicuous. I'll let the viewer interpret that for what they want. And I'll return to Smith with some instances from his later life. So Macdonald's first foray into anything resembling politics was he ran for alderman in 1842. This is in the context of the Governor General Metcalfe arriving. This was a big furor surrounding responsible government, and that is democracy in Canada. And Metcalfe came to put the hammer down. So this is about his election as alderman. The newspaper, the British Whig of Kingston, assured the electors that they would never have cause to regret choosing Macdonald and his teammate Robert Anglin, who was running for the post of common councilman. The Loyalist newspaper wound up the course of praise with a soaring finale, when it confidently predicted Macdonald would be returned with a triumphant majority. It proved to be exactly right. When on March 28th the election finally took place, Macdonald and Anglin were returned with ease and were chaired in triumph throughout the town. So this is both the British Whig newspaper and the conservative loyalist paper both praised Macdonald at this early point. And he's age 28 here, which is, again, tells us something about him from this relatively small community who knew him. So he partners in a new law firm and marries, also at age 28, to Isabel. Well, we'll just say Isabel Macdonald, but he got married at age 28. So once Governor General Metcalfe had installed himself, there was a revolt of his executive and legislative councils, basically the would-be cabinet. That's what they were fighting about, whether the cabinet had control over the Governor General or the Governor General had control of the cabinet, which was whether there was democracy or not, dumbing it down quite a bit. But Macdonald, in this crisis where the prerogative of the crown was called into question by the revolting cabinet, sided with the crown. So that also tells you something about him. The crisis gave Macdonald his first great political chance. He rushed into the struggle, and in Kingston it was a popular struggle for the defense of the legitimate prerogative of the crown against the evils of extreme party government. So this was another way that this event was characterized, was the Governor General, as a representative of the crown, was nonpartisan. And so, although his critics just like accused him of exerting dictatorial power, but in his view, he was not wanting to be dictator of the entire state, just maintaining the nonpartisan ability of the crown to, I believe, select the councillors and distribute patronage and things like this. But this was what the fight was about. Macdonald sided with the Governor General. On November 30, 4 days after the resignation of the ministers, when he presided once more at the annual dinner of the St. Andrew's Society, the occasion took on an even more defiantly conservative aspect than usual, and the guests and members sang "Charlie is my darling" when they toasted the Governor General. The following Monday, Macdonald and his conservative friends were present and prominent at the public meeting which the mayor called to take into consideration the question of an address to Metcalfe in the existing crisis. It was a rowdy meeting in a packed hall with a large preponderance of Metcalfe supporters. For the first time, Macdonald and the new generation of Kingston Conservatives appeared as popular leaders before a large crowd of their fellow citizens. Charles Stewart moved the first resolution. Macdonald followed with a resolution which declared, quote, that the firm, manly, and vigorous manner in which His Excellency has maintained the prerogative of the Crown, and at the same time upheld the just rights of all classes of the people, entitles him to our confidence, unquote. There was a fighting political speech which followed. With enthusiasm and with a certain colloquial familiarity of address, he began his defense of the imperial connection, of the governor, who was its prime symbol, and of the governor's just authority, outside the limits of responsible government, as sanctioned by Sydenham, Governor General Sydenham in 1841, to protect the rights of both races, that's French and British, and all classes of the population against the extremes of party rule. So this is how he characterized this crisis. Of course, the ministers who resigned were of the opposing party, or the Reform Party. So the party that Macdonald was not supporting. He started on a note which must have sounded real and authentic, as nothing else could have done, to an audience which only 6 years before had lived through the perils of the rebellion and the American raids. The basic issue of the controversy, he insisted, was the question of British supremacy. He reminded his listeners of the benefits of the imperial connection, of the protection it could be counted on to provide, and the vitally necessary defense it had given in 1837-1838. Most men in the crowd before him could remember well what militant republicanism had meant. The speech in the meeting as a whole, which to the annoyance of the reformers, capital R, had been a triumphant success, thrust Macdonald publicly and openly into the front rank of Kingston conservatives. So he was chosen to run after this for a member of the Assembly of Canada, which at this time consisted, of course, of Upper and Lower Canada solely. So during March 1844, Macdonald's now 29, though the Governor's Council was still incomplete and though Parliament had not been dissolved, he's calling it Parliament quite presumptuously, but the Assembly had not been dissolved, the Kingston Conservatives decided that it was time to begin preparations for the general election. Whom were they to choose as their candidate? Forsyth had failed, though not too badly, in 1841. Harrison, though he had resigned on the seat of government question, was suspected of having refused a place in Metcalfe's cabinet. The Kingstonians turned their backs on both these possibilities and selected Macdonald. The young lawyer's first political declaration was about as brief and as laconically non-committal as Forsyth's had been, but amid vague benevolent professions of devotion to the interests of Kingston and of loyalty to, quote, sound and liberal principles, unquote, principles of public policy, there was one long and significant sentence, quote, in a young country like Canada, Macdonald declared, I am of the opinion that it is of more consequence to endeavor to develop its resources and prove its physical advantages than to waste the time of the legislature and the money of the people in fruitless discussions on abstract and theoretical questions of government. Unquote. Perhaps it was in part a real profession of faith. Certainly in the politics of the time, it was an instantly recognizable party label. It identified Macdonald as a moderate, as a Sidonite, as a man who would support the governor, but who was not necessarily associated with the old Tory party. So he was elected a member of the Assembly for Kingston, age 29. As Macdonald sat, a relatively inconspicuous backbencher, in his place in the St. Anne's Market Building, this is when the Assembly was in Montreal, I believe, two obvious things about the Conservative majority in the House must have struck him immediately. In the first place, the majority was very small, and in the second, it was almost exclusively English-speaking. Once inside the Assembly, Macdonald gravitated immediately to the Liberal Conservative wing. Capital L Liberal, capital C Conservative wing. So we'll get into explaining this later. Some of its members he knew already. Yeah. But something that's important here, and this is the first time I'll mention it, but this is a big part of Macdonald's life, is that his wife had a serious chronic illness starting fairly soon after they were married. So Isa, which is what he called his wife, Isa was not well, far from well. She had been very ill indeed, and already, less than 2 years after her marriage, less than a year after her happy visit to her sister in the summer of 1844, the pattern of this dreadful recurring illness had become established and known in all its details. Her attacks came at intervals, rising in spasms to terrible climaxes, which left her exhausted, sunk in complete prostration, incapable almost of moving. This is 2 years after they were married. And this continues. So Macdonald sat in the assembly as a backbencher, and we'll see what's happening to him here. This is talking about William Blake, the Reform politician, later Liberal Party politician. Blake's speech, which purported to be a long historical and legal review of the background of the rebellion, was so shamelessly vitiated by its evasions and omissions, and so grotesquely Irish in its rasping belligerency, that Macdonald grew white with Highland Scots fury. I think there was a bill in the assembly to, the Rebellion Losses Bill, to basically give financial repayment to some of the rebels for losses or damages that they had incurred. So this is really insulting to the conservative element, the Tory element. But this is what they were discussing in the assembly. For long minutes he must have fidgeted and hesitated, and then, while Blake continued his interminable reading from old dispatches, garbling their contents so the Montreal Gazette assured its readers to justify rebellion, he could bear it no longer. He rose suddenly to a point of order. Quote, "I should feel obliged," he remarked tensely, "by the honourable member reading all the words." "What does the honourable member mean?" Blake inquired. "I want the honourable member to read the whole of it," Macdonald explains. "I shall do it for him myself if he wishes. It is parliamentary." "Is it parliamentary in reading documents to leave out whole sentences and parts of sentences?" McNab, that was the leader of the Tories, jumped to his feet to support his lieutenant. Such a partial reading of documents, he declared, would certainly be considered irregular at Westminster. Blake regarded them both with contemptuous defiance. "I shall read any part I like," he declared. The speaker quieted the resulting uproar. Blake swept on his way, unchecked and unrepentant, and finished shortly after a fierce peroration. The debate continued on a more humdrum and less provocative note, but in the meantime Macdonald had been very busy. Duels, which had been a reality 25 years before, were still a diminishing possibility in the 1840s, and challenges by which an explanation or an apology could frequently be extorted were regarded with enormous seriousness. While the debate proceeded, Macdonald sent his challenge, his threatening communication, quote unquote, and shortly after both he and Blake quietly left the assembly hall. So basically he challenged William Blake to a duel. This is age 34, 1849. And these two guys had a long history after this. What happened? So it was vaguely illegal, though. Macdonald was found, returned, and made his submission, but Blake, curiously enough, was not at home. Presumably, if the sergeant-at-arms was unable to find him, Macdonald's seconds would have been in a similar difficulty. It all ended happily on Monday, February 18, when the sergeant reported that he had also taken Mr. Blake into custody, and both repentant culprits bound themselves to keep the peace. The incident was over. So this is the prelude to things to come with him and Blake. It would be interesting to follow those two's career given this event, this, interesting event in 1849. Much longer, how many years did they face off against each other? I'm certain that they faced off against each other in the Parliament of Canada after Confederation, so that's at least probably 20 years later. The Rebellion Losses Bill was the political counterpart of the repeal of Corn Laws in England and the downfall of the old colonial system. Crowned and completed by the defeat of the Loyalists who had forfeited everything in its defence. After the passage of the Rebellion Losses Bill, Canada could no longer regard itself as a British province in their depressed minds. And with the repeal of the Corn Laws, the reality of its membership in the British Empire had come to an end. But the passage of the Rebellion Losses Bill caused some violence, I believe. It had become a foreign country governed by an alien race, so the Conservatives felt rather than reasoned. And when, on April 25, 1849, Lord Elgin, the Governor-General, came in from Monklands, I think that was his estate, to give his official acceptance to a number of measures, including the Rebellion Losses Bill, the Tory anti-French mob of Montreal plunged into an orgy of violence and incendiarism, which lasted for over a week. Macdonald did not apparently witness the blazing spectacle of the burning Parliament buildings. He was absent on April 26, the morning after the fire, when the chastened assembly met in the Bon Secours marketplace. Once again, though this time in an accidental fashion, he had been dissociated from the maddening extremism of his party. I'm just providing a window into the times by reading these passages. And something of Creigton's, both, of his writing style, that's all I'll say at the moment. So, Macdonald's first child died. So 2 years after he was married, his wife started to demonstrate this chronic illness. She was isolated to her bedroom for all the time. And so she stayed in Kingston in basically her bedroom, looked after by doctors. And Macdonald was away in Montreal at this point at the assembly. And then their first child died. Young. I'm not sure how young, but their first child died. This is in 1849, 1850. But a year later, his wife got pregnant and they had their second child, christened Hugh John Macdonald, and he survived. And he was named after John's father. I think Hugh is the only one that survived later in life. But we'll see about that. So enter George Brown. who even more than Blake was Macdonald's archenemy throughout his political career. Brown. He was an awkward, red-haired, extremely tall, extremely serious young Scotsman of firm views, great ambitions, and superabundant physical energy. In temperament, character, and convictions, he was almost the exact antithesis of Macdonald. A reformer, capital R, a stiff freekirker, an ardent voluntarist who abominated any connection between church and state, a passionately serious dogmatist to whom all compromise and accommodation were alien and difficult, Brown contradicted Macdonald's instinctive habit of thought. So Brown believed everything strongly. Sir John A was easygoing. I will qualify all the many detail or the nuances of that characterization. Brown, until a little over a year before, in Macdonald's eyes, had simply been the too vigorous editor, the too successful publisher of the Toronto Globe, precursor to the Globe and Mail, of course, a newspaper which, ever since its establishment in March 1844, had been one of the most pugnaciously effective of the official journals of the Reform side. And I'll detail from Creigton's notes at the end of this review the astonishing number of newspapers there were in this provincial society at this time, from which Creigton quotes a majority of the time in his notes. Creigton is, as I believe was pointed out in the introduction or foreword, was dogmatic on the primary sources, on basing history on the primary documents. And in his own writing, the local newspapers are extensively quoted. So George Brown. George Brown raises the Protestant cry against the domination of the Pope, which he saw in everything and anything. But John A., in contrast, was not a crusader with a mission, like Brown. It's a quote from Creigton. He thumped no tubs and banged no pulpits. He was far too concerned with the intricate details of concrete problems, far too interested in the curious and manifold complexities of human situations, unquote. Now I'm going to get into some specific anecdotes of Sir John A.'s behavior, public behavior, that demonstrate his personality. We haven't really learned too much about John A.'s personality yet. So, Isa had crept slowly and painfully out of the never-to-be-repeated agonies of motherhood and into that feeble, uneasy state of convalescence which had come to be her best substitute for health. She could never be a normal wife, a normal mother, a normal mistress of a married establishment, and the house, which might have been crowded with company and talk and laughter, kept at its very center a dim, hushed room, full of equivocal silences and nervous apprehensions. Isabella could match Macdonald's silent, dogged fortitude. She could rival the warmth of his emotional intensity, but it was beyond the strength of her broken body to respond to his gaiety, his buoyant vitality, his irrepressible genial interest in a multitude of people and things. I'll keep reading here because this tells us about the personality of his wife and himself. At the very heart of his existence there was not a denial, for Isabella never had the opportunity to give or refuse her part, but the utter impossibility of any real response. The long, hopeless years, with the familiar crises and recoveries and relapses of the sick room, never apparently calloused the tenderness of his affection with the hard skin of impatient familiarity. But there was a strong warm current in his nature which could find only a part of its scope and encouragement in his own home and his own office. He liked and understood people. He enjoyed the pace and bustle of affairs. He had convictions and he wanted power. Politics could not absorb him completely. Politics was not yet a vocation in Canada. The politicians at the time had to have their own incomes, and John A. kept up his law practice. Um, Politics was not yet a vocation in Canada, and even if it had been, he was probably not yet ready to accept the tyranny which such a vocation would certainly impose. He was a gifted amateur who had not yet decided to become a professional. There was a new confidence as well as the old zest in the way he played his part. The fortunes of politics favored his sudden advance. He had always been regarded as Draper's protege and heir. Draper was the conservative leader, along with McNab, I believe, or Draper was before McNab, as the best of the possible moderates, as the potential leader of the liberal conservatives, capital L, capital C. And now a film of discredit, the discredit of defeat or of temporary political disfavor, had apparently dulled the prestige of his old rivals, the high Tories, the survivors of the Toronto Family Compact. He had kept his tight, unshakable hold on Kingston, while several among his more important colleagues had failed to meet the basic political requirement of holding their riding. The party as a whole had done just as badly in the general election of 1851 as it had in the general election of 1847. For nearly 6 years, ever since the retirement of Draper and the discredit of Sherwood in the election of 1847, McNab had been the tacitly accepted conservative leader. The son of a United Empire loyalist, a soldier like his father, he had fought through the War of 1812 while still a boy in his teens, and had gained his knighthood for services in the rebellion of 1837. And in his red-faced, jovial, downright fashion, he gave the philosophy of the family compact what was perhaps its most primitive military expression. He had long been odious to the Gowanites. I don't know who the Gowanites were. He was becoming objectionably tiresome to large sections of the party, and recently a new political disturbance had deposited a small cloud of disapproval about his ruddy, genial countenance. The fact was that he appeared far too intimately connected with the government's ambitious railway policy. A hearty, simple-minded soul, who enjoyed every minute of his roguish existence, and who alternated with genial ease between a rather ostentatious wealth and an unabashed impecuniosity, McNab had always been a somewhat needy, greedy, not too scrupulous speculator. Now, in his older, more expansive years, he took to railways like a cheerful child to jam. He became president of the Great Western Railway. He was made chairman, though his party was in opposition, of the Parliamentary Committee on Railways, and he was alleged to have said, this shows you something of the lack of partisanship at the time. The leader of the opposition was made the head of a Parliamentary Committee on Railways, a significant thing at the time. And he was alleged to have said that, and the newspapers frequently repeated the aphorism, this is McNab, quote, "My politics now are railroads," unquote. As the summer of 1852 passed, and the time for the opening of the first session of Parliament drew closer and closer, it began to be hinted with unpleasant openness that the gallant knight was no longer free to oppose the government on any vital issue. Maybe, well, okay, so he was too committed to railways that maybe he couldn't contradict the government. From these insinuations, some conservative newspapers in both Toronto and Montreal went on to make the most damaging general assessment of Sir Allan's fitness for the post of leader. Then, having pronounced judgment against him, they took the final step of advocating the claims of John A. Macdonald. I'll skip ahead a little bit. Macdonald had no wish to oust the still indispensable McNabb, and he was apparently one of a number of Conservative members of Parliament who tried to put a stop to the controversy by signing a formal resolution in which they expressed confidence once more in their old leader. As Macdonald grew better known to the Assembly and the country, the popular picture of his character as a politician, of his distinctive style as a public man, became filled out in detail and warmer color. Nobody, not even his most enthusiastic supporters, ever thought of complimenting him on what were known in mid-19th century North America as the higher graces of oratory. So Macdonald was not known for eloquent oratory, but he had never liked and never tried to imitate the fashionable rhetoric of the period with its ornate vocabulary and inflated periods. These turgid pomposities he had long regarded as characteristically American and highly undesirable. The easy, informal, rather conversational manner, rising occasionally and naturally to bursts of eloquence, which he had always regarded as the great traditional style of the British House of Commons, was his own instinctive preference. He was a debater, and it was as a debater and as an, quote, exceedingly close reasoner, laconic, cogent, persuasive, and entertaining, that he was getting to be known. He dealt frequently and easily in irony, in comic exaggeration, and the note of light-hearted humour which crept disconcertingly in and out of his speeches delighted his followers and drove his opponents into a baffled state of half-amused exasperation. There's a hilarious anecdote of Macdonald's in opposition at this time here, in the way he spoke. So Drummond, Attorney General for Canada East, who on one occasion had to admit to making an absurd error in the government's railway legislation, was pursued by Macdonald with such genial dexterity that in blind rage he scarcely knew where to turn. He began by accusing his tormentor of, quote, flippancy. Then, with a brief effort to put the best face on the matter, went on to insist that Macdonald's, quote, pleasant lecture had really afforded him intense amusement. So Macdonald's, and we'll quote some of his statements here, his criticism of the guy was so funny that the guy, that in the assembly, the Attorney General had to admit that he found it hilarious. Then, with a brief effort to put the best face on the matter, Drummond went on to insist that Macdonald's pleasant lecture had really afforded him intense amusement, and ended up in a badgered, truculent fashion by demanding proof of the errors of omission and commission with which he had been charged. Macdonald blandly admitted that he had always tried to be good-humoured in debate, noted how excessively disagreeable Drummond had found his pleasantries, wondered why a government whose politics were admittedly railway politics should be so ignorant of its own basic legislation, and finally advised Francis Hincks, the, quote, Emperor Francis I, as the conservative newspapers called him, never to be out of the house in view of the, quote, awful messes into which his colleagues got themselves during his absence. So he's making fun of this guy in an extremely idiosyncratic way. And we'll get some more quotes from Macdonald. We get a sense of his personality. So, in Macdonald's eyes, one of the main points of the tradition of his craft was the British parliamentary system of government. If in politics he stressed the value of the constitutional inheritance from Britain, so in cultural matters he was prepared to recognize the strengths and importance of the Christian tradition. His upbringing, his political experience, and the instinctive, easygoing tolerance of his nature all helped to make it easy for him to realize how vital and how endlessly varied was the religious life of early Victorian Canada. Confronted with this uniform passion for religion, which is the case in colonial societies in Canada and the United States in the 19th century, and these passionate religious differences, especially between Protestant Upper Canada and Catholic Lower Canada, confronted with this uniform passion for religion and these passionate religious differences, both the secular-minded anti-clerical and deeply religious voluntarists were accustomed to preach the doctrine of the separation of church and state. But this simple and decisive solution was not Macdonald's first choice. He was quite prepared to accept the old conservative view that the state should recognize and assist the religious and cultural activities of the churches. He made, in fact, only one change in this venerable program, but a change of enormous importance. From the start, he tried to convince his conservative associates that they must liberalize and democratize the principles of recognition and assistance by extending their scope to all Christian communions without distinction. So, Sir John A., I think we can see he wasn't a hardliner. He was not a hardliner. He considered the old Tories, as Creigton calls them, his rivals in the Conservative Party, but we'll see that he really took the Conservative Party away from that hardline loyalist Tory element quite startlingly, primarily by allying with the French Canadians. In his view, the Conservatives must learn to recognize and respect not only the multiple religious divisions of Canada West, Ontario, but also the single basic cultural division between English-speaking and French Canada. It was this idea which governed his policy during the excited political-religious dispute of the early 1850s. He was prepared to accept the cultural life, the cultural duality of Canadian life. So here we're going to get some anecdotes of his incredibly complex, nuanced habits in the assembly, as he was essentially the lieutenant and sort of leader in the house. That's McNabb's lieutenant, but he was given quite a bit of leeway, especially in strategy in dealing with the government. I think there's still an opposition here. In fact, this is really important. I'm just going to take a slight break, and we're going to see his some of his most distinctive political traits here. So some of Macdonald's most prominent characteristics were his the way he played with the opposition, or if he was in opposition with the government in the assembly and in his strategy plots, his personality sort of comes out here. So the conservative or liberal conservative party had quite a varied bunch of people in it. And this varied bunch of people was the assortment of goods which Macdonald, quoting now from Creigton, this is Macdonald, age 38, 1853. This was the assortment of goods which Macdonald, now McNabb's principal assistant, could arrange inside the somewhat small and grimy panes of the conservative shop window. Because McNabb was a sort of jolly old guy, and Macdonald was becoming the sort of manager of the strategy in the assembly for the conservatives, liberal conservatives, with the Reform Party being the governing party. This was the assortment of goods which Macdonald, now McNabb's principal assistant, could arrange inside the somewhat small and grimy panes of the conservative shop window. But to drum up trade among conservative liberals and liberal conservatives, to win the custom of the French Canadians, this was the old objective. And now that the clear grits that were the George Brown's reformers were in the ministry, and the religious cultural controversy in full swing, it was possible for the Conservatives to give a new and persuasive twist to the old propaganda by which they had tried to convince the French Canadians that they were taking their patrons to the wrong shop. In the speech which Macdonald delivered on early September 1852 on the address in reply to the speech from the throne, this new direction was at least vaguely indicated. So this is an anecdote of one of Macdonald's behaviors or habits in the assembly, the way I characterize what he's doing here is he's trying to create divisions within his opponent, because as we can see in Canada at this point, it's a really complicated social and political situation as it is today. Maybe even more so today. But one of Macdonald's traits in the assembly was to sow seeds of doubt and division in the opposing party. And we'll see how he did this repeatedly. In the speech which Macdonald delivered early September 1852 on the address in reply to the speech from the throne, this new direction was at least vaguely indicated. Already, he informed his listeners, the radicals were jubilantly predicting that the great and progressive reforms were bound to come, now that the drag of Baldwin and LaFontaine, the reform leaders of the past, had been removed from the government. What could this possibly portend? Baldwin and LaFontaine, he informed Hincks reproachfully, the reform leader, were the most upright men with whom the Inspector General was ever allied, unquote. The Inspector General being the finance minister. They had dignified the past of the Reform Party, but now, with the clear grits in the government, who could safeguard its future? So he's saying this in the assembly, and basically what he's saying is he starts praising the old reform leaders. And by praising the old reform leaders, he's creating doubt in the mind of the new leader with respect to his old radicals, or with respect to his new radicals, George Brown and the clear grits. So Macdonald, but instead of just attacking the radicals, he addresses the leader and praises the old leaders, thereby sowing doubt in the mind of the new leader that perhaps these new guys are too radical. This is the way that he operated. And that this demonstrates a really sort of a multi-layered kind of he was one tricky guy. hopefully the viewers can get the situation here. He's sowing seeds of doubt in the minds of his opponents, trying to create internal divisions in his opponents. And he does this all the time. Um, so we see this again in variations of this. And so the government was a coalition of these Reform Party elements, the uh, more centrist Hinks, who was, and the more radical Protestant George Brown and the Clear Grits. But this was the coalition of Reform coalition that was governing in 1851, and Macdonald was in opposition. So in this context, which was a really tight majority in the assembly where things could go either way on any vote. It was a tight situation, and its difficulties were never better illustrated than the so-called Ecclesiastical Corporations Bill of 1853. So this is a bill in 1853 that the Reform Party, just a minor thing that they thought they would kind of streamline approval of Roman Catholic, incorporation of or chartering of Roman Catholic institutions, and they were going to basically give the Catholic Church a little bit more leeway in the government approving of different things it was doing or whatever. And so Macdonald knows that George Brown and the Clear Grits, the extreme Protestants, probably what this now you can see the way Macdonald's mind is turning here. It was certain that George Brown would oppose the bill. But what of the Clear Grits, those restless, unhappy, conscience-stricken creatures who listened duly with one unwilling ear to the orders of their government whips, and with the other hearkened yearningly to Brown's irrefutable logic? So they voted as individuals during this period, you see. They didn't even go with their own factional leader, let alone their party leader. He's talking about the Clear Grits. Obviously, their vote was very uncertain, and after March 8, when Brown delivered his enormous vituperative oration against the bill, the rumors of dissatisfaction and impending revolt among the Clear Grits, the Baldwinite reformers, that's the more centrist reformers, and even among the French Canadians, began to grow and circulate rapidly. Could it be that the government could be defeated on the measure? And in such a crisis, what policy should the Conservatives adopt? Macdonald obviously enjoyed surprise, shock tactics, plots, as he called them, and it is not too difficult to see his guiding hand in the disposition of the Conservatives on this occasion. This is really complex parliamentary party politics, but it'll give an indication of both the times and Macdonald's political personality, behavior. It is not too typical to see Macdonald's guiding hand in the disposition of the Conservatives on this occasion. The party waited developments in ambush. So the governing centrist Reform Party would have thought in this relatively inconsequential bill that the Conservatives the moderate Conservatives would have not had a problem with this bill. They would have expected them not to vote with the extreme Protestants. But as the bill was circulating and the vote was coming, it appeared that Macdonald had united the Conservatives in a plot. Not a single Conservative arose to debate Brown's amendment. And on March 10, when the debate resumed, McNabb's entire following still remained fixed in a mysterious and sinister silence. That night the galleries were crowded. Rows of priests and Roman Catholic dignitaries sat watching anxiously for the result. And as Drummond, the Attorney General for Canada East, ramblingly continued his protracted, perhaps deliberately protracted speech, because the whips started to realize that there was a plot by the Conservatives to bring down the government, and they realized that they had to get votes, and so he kept talking while the whip was running around getting the votes. As Drummond, the Attorney General for Canada East, ramblingly continued his protracted, perhaps deliberately protracted speech, the desperate struggle for votes went on. These reformers were observed flying about the house, now soft soldering or soft sweet talking, a refractory grit, and again pulling the traces on the right side of a leg of a kicking French Canadian. There was, a Tory correspondent noted with malicious satisfaction, a peculiar goneness in the stricken countenance of the clear grit David Christie as he contemplated the horrifying vision of his angry Freekirk constituents back in Wentworth. So Macdonald is sowing seeds of division in the Reform Party by siding with the extreme Protestants against making them vote for a Roman Catholic measure, which is going to create anger amongst their constituents and divisions within the Reform coalition. There was, a Tory correspondent noted with malicious satisfaction, as for the poor Amos Wright of East York, he was so flattered and fondled by great men in high offices that he looked as bewildered with unexpected honours as an interesting young widow giving herself away in matrimony. Then at last, when Drummond's long speech drew to its close, the vote came. The entire body of Conservatives, together with Brown and his fellow Radicals and a handful of French Canadians, voted for the amendment and against the bill. They mustered 34 votes. But the government had obtained 39. It had won, but only with the support and humiliation of the clear grits. So Macdonald approached this. First of all, he was going possibly for a vote of non-confidence. But if that failed, in the threat of non-confidence, what he was really doing was sowing division in the opposition. Thus, he was baiting the government. This is so incredibly complex, but this shows the level of deviousness, both in Macdonald and in this incredibly complex. See, in these instances, the individual votes mattered and could bring down the government if they lost a vote, or it would call a subsequent non-confidence vote. But basically, he had the majority centrist reformers thinking that he was going for a vote of non-confidence, but what he was really doing was forcing the extreme liberal members to vote against their constituents to avoid a vote of non-confidence, thereby sowing division within the opposing party and providing fodder for the Conservatives in those ridings in the next election. This is the level of his trickery. And the reformers realized what he was doing. So then Macdonald gets up to explain why he had departed from the conservative, moderate conservatives' traditional policy of supporting the Catholics in Quebec. because he had voted with the extreme Protestants for this complicated ruse. But he breezed it off. He says, Macdonald had now to talk his way out of the position into which he had placed the Conservative Party. The opposition had done better than in any previous division in the new House, but the Conservative ruse had failed of its daring objective to overthrow the ministry. Its first objective. The party had voted as a body with Brown, and its course, to say the least, required some defense and explanation. McNabb's defense was brief and rather feeble, and a good deal depended on Macdonald's reply. He did what probably nobody in the House besides himself would have thought of doing, or dared to do. He gave only the briefest of explanations, assuring the French Canadians at the very end of his speech that the Conservatives did not, of course, object to ecclesiastical corporations as such, but only to the general and laxity of the present bill. He hardly bothered with a defense at all. Instead, he burlesqued the whole episode of the vote which the House had just recorded, covered the unhappy Grits with ridicule, which was his main goal in all this complexity, and kept the whole House laughing over the preposterous divisions in the government. Never before, he declared, everybody was in good humour when Macdonald resumed his description of the monstrous, hydra-headed government whose agonized convulsions were so fascinating to behold that the conservatives preferred to watch them in attentive silence. Office was the one thing that kept the government together, and office and the well-filled purse of a developing young country had brought the clear Grits submissively to heel once again. Quote, he's making fun of them. These honorable gentlemen of more than common political virtue, these purists who would sweep away from their principles, who would sweep everything away from their principles, these clear Grits, the pure silica of Upper Canada, voted for the government against their principles. Never again did they face their constituents with impunity. So he's playing a really complicated game to sow division amongst his opponents and make ridicule. This is just one instance of what he does here. Now, there was another riot, but this time the Catholics in Montreal rioted. But what did Macdonald do with this situation? Well, this demonstrates another one of his political characteristics. So towards the end of May, Father Alessandro Gavatzi, a veteran of the Italian Revolution of 1848 and ex-friar of the Roman Catholic Church, arrived in Toronto to begin a Canadian lecture tour. Gavatzi was a liberal in politics who had become an evangelical Protestant, and after the collapse of the Roman Republic had driven him into exile in 1849, he had traveled about the English-speaking world lecturing to large responsive audiences. His mission, he announced with grandiloquent comprehensiveness, was nothing less than the total destruction of the Pope and Popery. He was a tall, stout man with a powerful voice, and at once insinuating and commanding, and a strongly marked, extremely expressive countenance, radiating magnetic force and vehement conviction. When he appeared before an audience, he wore a long, full black robe ornamented with a purple cross on the breast and left shoulder. This guy is quite the figure here. So he makes a lecture tour in Toronto to the extreme Protestants to great fanfare, but then he goes up to Quebec, to Lower Canada, what's going to happen there? Basically, there was a riot in Montreal by the Catholics. The troops were called out by the governor, and they killed a bunch of Protestants. So George Brown, this is a serious situation. Macdonald's whole conception of the future of conservatism was in danger because Macdonald was based on his he was a more of a moderate who was trying to appeal to clemency for the Catholics in Quebec and to get them to join his coalition. Macdonald's whole conception, but this was a disaster for any kind of a moderate, and it seemed like the Protestants and Catholics were going to go at each other. Macdonald's whole conception of the future of conservatism was in danger. Some of his followers were ready to bolt. His policies had apparently been made meaningless by the horrors of the Gavatzi riots. He did not reappear in Parliament for the last months of the session. He said and did little. He simply waited. And as the summer of 1853 slowly passed along, it began to seem possible that he had not waited entirely in vain. So this is where an instance of where Macdonald gets his nickname, his political nickname, which was Old Tomorrow. Macdonald's nickname was Old Tomorrow because he had this habit of purposely doing nothing. And sure enough, in a controversial situation, he did nothing, and eventually some other problem arises where people forgot about the previous crisis, which is what he did in this instance, and it worked. Old Tomorrow. So here's another scandal. Continual scandals and riots. This one's called the 10,000 pound job. This is funny. So the 10,000 pound job was the reform leader Francis Hincks had was this speculating financially and very complicated bond sales and purchases, which he appeared to have netted 10,000 pounds in some kind of an insider trading deal. Anyways, so this was called the 10,000 pound job, which the conservatives and the press were throwing around. And all that autumn and winter, the public ear was attentively cocked. This is 1853. What were the other high notes in Mr. Hincks' soaring financial melody? Who had paid for the 1,008 shares of stock from which he was credited in the books of his own creation, the Grand Trunk Railway? Had he known when he speculated in the stock of the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railway that it was certain to be absorbed on advantageous terms by the Grand Trunk? By what means had he possessed himself of a piece of property which happened to lie so conveniently close to the destined junction of the railway at Point Levis? So there's dirt here that they smell on the reform leader. So Macdonald's, now once again, he demonstrates in this thing his one of his principal political traits of pitting his opponents against each other and creating divisions within his opponent. So last session, every government spokesman had insisted on the omnicompetence of the existing legislature. This session, with equal unanimity, they had proclaimed Parliament's lack of moral authority to make law. It was an absurdly obvious contradiction, Macdonald argued, which arose solely from the government's desire to evade a parliamentary inquiry into their own misdeeds. These corrupt misdeeds had been repudiated by everyone, including reformers, including even the Inspector General's own colleagues. For Malcolm Cameron, the Postmaster General, had declared at a public dinner in Perth that he did not approve of the Point Levis purchase. The first primitive duty of any member of any administration was not to speculate in public funds and public property. Pitt, that's British Prime Minister William Pitt, and here came one of Macdonald's characteristic appeals to the conduct of his favorite statesman, that's William Pitt, Prime Minister during the Napoleonic Wars, I believe, had for years remained completely unmoved by the attack made on him. He's describing something Pitt did. For years, Pitt had remained completely unmoved by all the attacks made on him. But when once it was charged that he had speculated in public funds, he immediately filed suit in slander. So instead of going attacking the government, saying you're crooked, what Macdonald does here is he refers to a historical authority figure, an instance where this exemplary prime minister had filed suit when somebody had publicly accused him of speculating in public funds. And so he uses this comment of this reform cabinet minister criticizing the purchase of his leader of this property at the end of the railway to insinuate that, to question why the reform leader Hincks didn't file suit. Why didn't he file suit against this serious accusation for slander? In other words, he's insinuating that there's something real there that the leader doesn't want to file suit about. So he's sowing division within his political opponent. This is incredibly complicated, but it works. It was a particularly savage attack, and even the Toronto Leader, a government newspaper which the conservative journals delighted to refer to as Tsar Francis I's court circular, admitted rather rightly that Macdonald had displayed more talent in the assault than the world usually gives him credit for possessing. That's a reform newspaper saying that. Hincks, the reform leader, pushed unceremoniously into an awkward corner, arose to give a somewhat labored account of his purchase of the Point Levis property. So they're just it's just a mess. And Macdonald is just creating division within. Cameron got up to explain away his statement at the Perth dinner and to denounce Macdonald for repeating the falsehoods which foul-mouthed slanders had been spreading for months against the government. Charges, recriminations, and countercharges were bandied about for a couple hours between the alleged reform railway plunderers of the past and the alleged the alleged reform railway plunderers of the present and the alleged conservative land grabbers of the past. What a mess. This also demonstrates the years that Macdonald spent in opposition. He wasn't in power when he first started out anyways. And we're at age 30, 38, 39 here. His odd, ugly, memorable head, with its pile of dark, curly hair, its big nose. Macdonald had a big nose. Its gay, friendly eyes and genially sardonic smile did not inevitably suggest the great political idealist or the great practical politician of the future. In his speech, in his easygoing manner, his whole youthful appearance, he did not seem to conform exactly to any of the plates in the political fashion book of the period. Certainly his garments had not been cut from the sober, heavy black broadcloth in which Canadian Party leaders had appeared in the past. Draper had been a serious man, Baldwin a very solemn man, and Hincks, though on occasion he had displayed an acid wit, like that of a precociously knowledgeable street gamin, had been a bleakly clever, drably efficient administrator. Macdonald differed from all these predecessors in a fashion at once puzzling and disarming. He obviously enjoyed politics, just as he apparently enjoyed every other part of life. His conviviality, his exuberant gaiety, his perpetual flow of robust animal good spirits had now become famous. I dare say, quote, I dare say his old partner Alexander Campbell, that's his law partner, wrote, quote, you are very busy from night until morning and again from noon till night. So he's saying the Macdonald got up at noon. That's what he's saying. And that was probably the truth. Another glass of champagne and a story of doubtful moral tendency, with a little of the Honourable John Macdonald's peculiar sawder, that's 19th century slang for an alcoholic beverage, are elements in the political strength of a Canadian ministry not to be despised. This is his law partner saying humorously. Undoubtedly, his smiling capacity for liquor and his bawdy stories were all elements of strength, but he was occasionally a hard drinker who took too much and kept on taking too much. And the knowledge of these habits strengthened the impression of easygoing conviviality and possibly helped to lead the undiscerning into a serious underestimation of his basic abilities. Now, this is really descriptive of Macdonald, so I'm going to keep going here. Yet there were some good qualities which even the skeptics and the Puritans were willing to concede him. Quote, he can get through more work in a given time than anybody I ever saw and do it well, unquote, recorded John Langdon, the member for Peterborough. And it was the same caustic and critical John Langdon who generously insisted that Macdonald's, quote, talent was undoubted and that his, quote, character for integrity stood very high, unquote. Almost everybody, opponents as well as friends, agreed that Macdonald's conservative inheritance was qualified by a genuine liberalism. Even William Lyon Mackenzie, the rebel leader from the small rebellion, rather grudgingly admitted that Macdonald had, quote, something of the liberal spirit in him, unquote. And Langdon recalled that his instincts and associations were all with the Liberals, capital L Liberals, the Liberal Party arising here. And people thought that he had been thrown by circumstances on the wrong side of the house. These, for a man who wanted to modernize and liberalize his party, were assets of very high order. But were they not even so outbalanced by those liabilities which seemed so lamentable in the eyes of early Victorian Canada? Quote, he is fond of pleasure, Langton wrote with grave severity. Yeah, so he's not very Victorian. He is fond of pleasure, Langton wrote with grave severity, and has an almost boyish exuberance of animal spirits and of poco-curantism, even know what that means, and want of earnestness in any pursuit, which will always prevent him from being a successful leader. So this is a guy criticizing him, saying he's not serious enough. What was to be done with such a scandalously flippant creature? Could a man who did not even bother to pretend to seriousness be taken very seriously? Langton did not believe so. In his judicious, tolerant, but disapproving manner, he wrote Macdonald down. Quote, his instincts are all good, he summed up, but he takes the world too easily to be much depended on, unquote. So this characterizes Macdonald as not the moral Victorian, the dour moral Victorian. If anybody, that was George Brown, his opponent, the leader of the eventual Liberal Party. So I've heard that Macdonald was characterized more as a leftover from the 18th century. For example, the sort of lax morality of the 18th century statesmen as contrasted with the more strict moral behavior of Victorian Britain and Victorian period generally. Macdonald's almost a leftover from the 18th century, but it may have been more his individual personality was like that, or even that he apparently Pitt was his idol, so maybe he was genuinely. Of course, a lot of that behavior carried on into the 19th century too, but people forget that the Reform Party and the Liberal Party in Britain was the Protestant party, and our conceptions of liberal and conservative have been in the present day influenced way too much by this dualistic current Republican Democrat thing going on in the States. And then we have to understand that we're in a different time here. Here, the conservative leader, Macdonald, was more the 18th century waking up at noon, drinking, um, all this. And Winston Churchill was also like that to a certain extent. And he was like that. We should also remember that Macdonald was a contemporary of Disraeli and had a lot of respect for Disraeli, Disraeli being the more big time. And he met Disraeli later, but that's in the second book. Just some general observations on the United Province of Canada legislature. 1856, we see free votes. That is, individual members allowed to vote against their own party. This made it such a ruckus debating forum. We saw instances in that bill where the government could fall based on who voted what, or they would immediately hold a second vote to see if they lost a vote, if it was a vote of non-confidence. But there was individual voting to a high extent. I mean, there's a specific bill that I can demonstrate this from in 1856. Free votes in the legislature. Something on the international context of these provincial events and political scene. This is approaching one of Macdonald's most famous ruses, the double shuffle. But we'll just state something on the international context of this time in the provincial political scene we've been looking at so far. So, the Crimean War. So the Crimean War, the first great war which the British Empire had fought since the Napoleonic conflict nearly 40 years before, had compelled the province to think seriously about its defenses. This is the Crimean War between Britain and Russia, or Britain, France, and Russia. And, it's funny, you don't hear anybody right now with this Russia-Ukraine thing, the West weighing in, not directly fighting Russia, but the Crimea is in Ukraine. And nobody even remembers the Crimean War. But anyways, that's what's going on here. The Crimean War, the first great war which the British Empire had fought since the Napoleonic Wars. And the Conservative government, with Sir Allan MacNab taking the principal initiative. So John A's in power now, but MacNab's the first minister. Macdonald's a cabinet minister. Sir Allan MacNab, taking the principal initiative, had overhauled the venerable militia system. venerable militia system, and established a small but fairly efficient volunteer force. This is Creigton's Toronto perspective. Um, you know, I don't know how the Americans would have estimated this venerable militia system. The Civil War coming on. Um, a certain amount of military enthusiasm and reforming zeal was thus an early product of the war, but by the time it ended, it had brought on something not very far removed from a panic, at least in the innermost circles of government. Once again, as had happened during the Napoleonic Wars, a major military struggle in the Old World was accompanied by a crisis with the United States of America, a crisis in which Canada would inevitably be involved, though she had no responsibility whatever for its creation. It had been brought on by Great Britain, which, in a desperate need of men, had passed the Foreign Enlistment Act, and by the British ministry to Washington, and the Nova Scotia politician Joseph Howe, we'll hear a lot of later in Macdonald's career, who with imprudent patriotism set out to apply the act in the United States, despite all the stringent American neutrality laws. Howe, who was moving about the United States like a somewhat theatrical conspirator in search for men, appealed to the Canadian government to accept recruits, but McNab and his cabinet, advised by the cautious Governor-General, Head, would have nothing to do with the whole affair, and a year later, when the United States exacted its delayed revenge and dismissed the British ambassador and 3 British consuls, they could at least congratulate themselves on their caution. Yet inevitably, the province became the innocent victim of the storm of anti-British and annexionist rage which swept through the United States. Palmerston and the Secretary for War, British Secretary for War, realized the danger of an explosion and, freed now from the demands of the Crimean War, dispatched 5 regiments to Canada and a vast quantity of military stores. This is a situation where the British Empire is still a fighting force, and the Americans. We have to put ourselves back in this time period. Joseph Howe, Nova Scotia Democratic, populist politician, goes around the United States trying to recruit members to join the British in the Crimean War. Well, the Americans are not going to take very kindly to that. And then after the Crimean War, Britain dispatches 5 regiments to Canada and a vast quantity of military stores. And the Americans are just going to be ticked off here, to say the least. But I think, well, we're in 1857. Maybe they were just so preoccupied with the lead up to the Civil War that they never did anything, although they expelled the British ambassador from Washington. Pretty serious stuff for Canada, not for the Americans so much. But, so that's 1856. Macdonald is 41 years old. 1857, his wife dies. So after 12 years of this horrible solitary, her being confined to her bedroom basically, and unable to go with Macdonald to the capital. At this period alternated between Toronto, Montreal, and Quebec City. So it's just tragic. His family life, his one son who survived, his wife was with him in Toronto when the capital was in Toronto for a period, and his son was there too, but his son was sick a lot of the time too. So this is about the death of his wife in 1857. It was the expected, inevitable end for what had been, for almost a dozen years, a grey, unrelieved tragedy. Life had cheated him terribly. He had given everything where, in the very nature of the case, there could be never could be a full and satisfying response. By the two supreme efforts of her life, Isabella had borne children. One of them had lived, but for years she had been a bedridden invalid who was physically incapable of giving him the love, the support, and the companionship which he craved. It was all over now. The agony of worry, the aching feeling of incompleteness, the patched habit of cheerful resignation. But for 12 years it had twisted his whole life. He had become a family man whose home was a hotel or a lodging house, a bachelor husband who had to go for companionship to bars and lounges and smoking rooms, a frustrated host who drank too much on occasion, partly because it was the only way he could entertain, and because it passed the empty time, and because it was an easy way to forget. So this explains one aspect of Macdonald's drinking. So returning to the assembly, in the assembly, George Brown led a clamorous and exultant opposition. Macdonald's now in government, but not as just as a cabinet minister. Politically, Macdonald lived somewhat of the lieutenant of McNab. Politically, Macdonald lived from day to day in a state of constant and irritating uncertainty. The House was a tossing ship in which at almost any moment he expected to lose his balance and fall headlong. During the first month of the long session he became ill, as he had done in the previous March, and for days of convalescence he dragged himself about with painful difficulty. It was pleasant to escape for a week's end to John Ross's house 5 miles out in the country on Davenport Road outside Toronto, to have 2 good nights' rest and to spend Sunday lounging in peaceful ease on the sofa. But this respite was very brief, and on Monday he found himself facing George Brown and his confident, truculent supporters once more. Quote, "We are having a hard fight in the House," he told his sister Margaret, "and shall beat them in the votes, but it will, I think, end in my retiring as soon as I can with honor." So he's down in the dumps here. His wife died. He's age 43. He's talking about retiring. "I find the work an annoyance too much for me," unquote. He was depressed by weariness, by the continued drear sense of personal loss, by the unhappy realization of political defeat in his old province of Upper Canada, and finally by a vague feeling that his own political mission had finished. He had formed the Liberal Conservative Party, and in the clergy reserves and these other measures, he had helped to settle the outstanding issues of the past. But it was not the past that counted, it was the present and future, and here he could still not see a bold and easy course ahead. So I've got a picture of Macdonald from 1840, or when he was 43. There we go. John A. Macdonald, leader of the Upper Canadian Conservatives, about 1857. People can see that. It's hard because there's a lag on the So the double shuffle. Macdonald was getting really ticked off by George Brown, who just kept hammering him. And there's lots of crises and tragic things going on in Macdonald's life. He pulls a scheme on Brown that became probably the thing he was most famous for. This double shuffle that he did, this high stakes scheme. So we saw in that previous instance where he was prepared to bring about a non-confidence vote and to overthrow the government on something that he didn't even believe in, and the Conservatives didn't believe in, but failing that, he was looking to divide his opponents. But here he plays high stakes and literally allows the defeat of his own government to get a secondary result in dividing his opponents. This is what this is. If any party government did this now, I don't think they're smart enough now to pull this off. But we're going to read about the double shuffle, Macdonald's ultimate baiting. So, on Wednesday, July 28, an address to the Queen on the subject of the location of the capital was mooted. Amendments, and still more ingenious amendments, were suggested, and finally Pichet moved that, quote, in the opinion of this House, the city of Ottawa ought not to be the permanent seat of the government of this province. Macdonald intervened late in the debate. He reminded the House of the long, acrimonious dispute which had moved the legislature itself to seek the royal intervention. They had referred the question of the location of the capital to Queen Victoria. And he condemned the resolution before the House as a brusque and uncourteous insult to Her Majesty. A few minutes later, the vote came in, and as the Brownites had gleefully anticipated, the necessary block of French-Canadian votes changed sides. The government had been defeated 64 to 50. So you think Macdonald had seen this coming? Of course he did. Flushed and excited, Brown jumps to his feet. The vote which had just been carried, he explained triumphantly to the House, was in reality an express disapproval of the entire policy of the government. But in order to put this interpretation of the events to the test, he would move the adjournment. So this is an example of the government lost a vote, but there was free votes allowed in the assembly, in the legislature this time. And so losing a vote did not necessarily mean a defeat of the government. There was a second vote always after the government lost a vote to state explicitly if the members intended this to be a vote of non-confidence in which the government would fall. So Brown jumps to his feet and puts forward a motion of general non-confidence because he thinks he's got Macdonald here. Macdonald accepted the motion of non-confidence. So you think Macdonald's being genuine here? Macdonald accepted the motion to adjourn as a deliberate challenge to his government. So and the House, as most people accept the overcrowded grids might have expected, immediately reversed itself. Okay, so they reversed it. They didn't vote general vote of non-confidence. The whole incident could have been dismissed as unimportant, but Macdonald decided at once that he would take it seriously. So he is going to force a vote of non-confidence. The next day, or 2 days later, July 30, during a scene of odd and somewhat equivocal hilarity, so they lost the vote of confidence. He tempted Brown. He baited Brown. The appeal to the Queen, if it had not been his invention, Macdonald decided at once he would take it seriously. This whole challenge. The appeal to the Queen, if it had not been his, or he's pretending to, If it had not been his invention, had at least received his emphatic support, he may have intended merely to repudiate the vote as a reversal of his government's declared policy. He may have hoped to escape from the difficult position to teach the irresponsible assembly the consequences of its folly, to force the Sovereign House to take him back again on his own terms. And finally, was he not clearly aware from the beginning that the resignation of the Liberal Conservative government would place a blindly overconfident Brown to the greatest temptation of his career, the temptation to accept office on the basis of a majority which, in the nature of the case, could only be ephemeral, the temptation to wreck his own future and the prospects of the Grit Party by a premature grasp of power? So Macdonald's baiting Brown. He's baiting Brown into a vote of non-confidence. So that night, when a new and this time insignificant motion to adjourn had been passed, Macdonald called a late informal meeting of his colleagues. So he's letting his colleagues in on his ruse here. Before they went to bed, a majority of the ministers had decided to resign, and their decision, communicated next morning to their colleagues in the Legislative Council, was quickly made unanimous. Early in the forenoon, Thursday, July 29, the Macdonald-Cartier ministry tendered its collective resignation to Governor Head. Yeah, I had thought that on the first vote he purposely had baited, but it looks like the government was defeated on a bill. There was quickly a second vote to see if it was a vote of non-confidence. It was not. They voted on the second motion not to overthrow the government. But in this process, Macdonald raised the third motion that he must have perceived that the Liberals were really anxious for power here and might be able to be. So he purposely got his ministers to support this third motion and resigned. Early in the forenoon, Thursday, July 29, the Macdonald-Cartier ministry tendered its collective resignation to Governor Head. A quarter of an hour later, when the assembly opened at the usual hour, Macdonald gave a lengthy explanation of the course he and his colleagues had taken. After the adjournment, at his last brief conversation with Head, he learnt that the governor had sent for Brown and that Brown had asked for time to consult his friends. Quote, after that, Macdonald later concluded from his account of the affair, quote, I had no conversation, direct or indirect, with His Excellency of any kind. And this was true. He was not colluding with the Governor General here. He was playing the Liberals, the opposition. The next day, on really high stakes, the next day, July 30, during a scene of odd and somewhat equivocal hilarity, the ex-ministers gave up their places on the Treasury benches, and Macdonald seated himself comfortably on the opposition side to watch with interest what would happen. This is high stakes. He had not long to wait for the denouement. The gods finished their sport with George Brown very quickly, and indeed they had little need to manipulate circumstances, for Brown's infatuated presumption had brought about his swift undoing. He had, as he no doubt realized from the beginning, no chance in the new House. The members of his new cabinet, in accepting office, would automatically forfeit their seats and be obliged to seek re-election. This is a little quirk of the time Macdonald must have been aware of. And this would temporarily remove 8 or 10 stout reformers from the Assembly. In a fairly evenly balanced House, where small numbers counted seriously, this temporary loss would be important, but far more important was the undoubted fact that the original majority on the seat of government question had been purely accidental, the result of special circumstances unlikely to be repeated. Perhaps Brown expected that in the end the governor would feel obliged to call an election. In the lobbies and corridors of the legislature, the Grits were jubilantly predicting this, and Macdonald and his followers in grave uncertainty waited unhappily for the outcome. So Macdonald is gambling. If the Governor General decided to call an election at this point, Brown would have continued as first minister and a leader of the government. But if the Governor General decided to allow the House to sit for a little longer, this new Brown government would fall instantly. So this is why Macdonald was clarifying that he had no communication with the Governor General, and that he was gambling on this purely himself. That he didn't know that the Governor General would not call an election and would force the new government to sit in the House and try to win a vote. Brown perhaps expected that in the end the Governor General would have to call an election. At noon on Monday, August 2nd, the Brown-Dorian government, this is just 2 days later, at noon on Monday, the Brown-Dorian government was sworn in, and a little after the House met for its afternoon session, one of the writs of election made necessary by the new appointments to office was proposed, and the motion immediately amended by a want of confidence resolution. Before the House adjourned at midnight, the amendment had been carried by a large majority of 40. The next day, both verbally and in writing, the new ministers advised the governor to dissolve the House and appeal to the people. Head refused, so he refused to call an election. And on Wednesday, August 1st, after having lasted almost exactly 2 days, the Brown-Dorian government ceased to exist. Holy smoke. It was not 1 month, it was only 8 days since Macdonald and his colleagues had tendered their resignations on July 29th. And although Clause 7 had been pretty obviously designed to permit individual changes of portfolio without the expense of an election, so there was a clause that said that, well, I'll relate the detail in a second. There seemed no reason to believe that it would not validate a general shift of the entire ministry. So there was a rule that the ministers in the government could switch portfolios without calling an election. So Macdonald bet on this rule allowing his governments to return to power, but just switch portfolios. On August 6th, Macdonald was sworn in again as in a different cabinet post, and most, though not all, of his colleagues were similarly assigned to offices which they had no intention of occupying permanently. Then they just switched back to their original portfolios. They occupied them, in fact, only 1 day, and on August 7th, they all changed back to their proper portfolios once more. This was the double shuffle. And obviously George Brown was almost had a heart attack. He was so mad at this whole, what he considered a manipulation of democracy. Oh my goodness. The double shift, where it was soon became popular known, the double shuffle, permitted all the old members of the Macdonald Cartier government to keep their seats in the assembly at the very moment when the ex-ministers of the Brown-Dorian cabinet had lost their parliamentary places as well as their political power. For the baffled and furious Grits, this was the last insufferable affront. They announced it as a fraudulent evasion of the Independence of Parliament Act, an evasion made possible by an act of mass perjury on the part of the ministers who had sworn to perform the duties of offices which they had no intention of occupying. It was an outrageous swindle, the last piece of knavery in a long and complicated plot which had begun with the resignation of the Macdonald-Cartier government, which had involved the governor and Macdonald in collusion, so they accused them, and which had been devised to defeat the innocent reformers and defraud the long-suffering people of Canada. Macdonald rejected this melodramatic invention with a sweeping denial. It's a charge that I am a dishonorable man, he told the House. A charge that the representative, our sovereign, myself, and my colleagues, if they have any concern in the matter, are alike dishonorable conspirators. And here in my place in Parliament, I say it is as false as hell. It seems that he was in a really raw mood and he decided to play a high stakes game of poker. And he won. The double shuffle. Macdonald's most famous maneuver. So I'm going to move a little more quickly here in the latter part of the book. Creigton, as we can see here, and I'm sure you've gathered from the tone of the writing, Creigton is a proponent of Sir John A. He does not spend time on possible defects. Now, this book is written in 1952. That's the explanation for that is what it appears on the surface of it. That's at this period, John A. Macdonald was a Canadian hero, and Creigton sees no reason to question that, although he's, of course, you'd have to say, even in relating his drinking habits and everything else along those lines, he presents it in a positive light. Although I have to say that his look at the notes, there's just continual reference from the primary sources here, letters to other politicians, relatives, newspaper, clippings from speeches. We'll see in the final, my summary of the notes. I think I'm going to just take a slight break here before the home stretch to the last end of the book. So, besides his commitment identification with Britain, Macdonald doesn't stand out as a man who held principles too as too important, almost shamelessly Machiavellian. Also, not until speaking to her 1860 did he give stump speeches. It's more of an 18th century politician, you'd have to say. Um, Although after his career was so long, now we haven't even gone to the second half of his career. So the fact that he started stumping in 1860 actually doesn't mean that he did change after that. He was in power until the 1880s. So this John A. Macdonald is an absolute giant of a political figure in Canadian history. But he didn't uh, adopt the more 19th century American form of giving political stump speeches around, upper and lower Canada or Ontario, Quebec, and then the other provinces, the maritime provinces, after Canada had been formed a confederation. He became more like that later, but at this point, no. Um, like many English-speaking Canadians of his generation, he saw the Civil War in the United States as the discredit of democracy and republicanism. This was a major factor in Confederation, particularly the uh, high level of authority vis-a-vis the province that the federal government was given and as advocated by Macdonald. The United Provinces of Canada, as everybody can probably see by these anecdotes from the assembly, was a complete mess, chaotic, incredibly difficult thing to govern, almost never a clear majority. But it was a marvelously democratic place too, where because it was so insecure on every vote, there was real debate and members voted individually according to their personal conviction, but it made for a really democratic assembly, um, but also very difficult to maintain a clear majority. And this instability was a factor in the two central Canadian provinces wanting confederation as some sort of solution from their own continual difficulty and insecurity. But this in the immediate lead up to Confederation, and I'm going to get into Confederation more in the second book, but Creigton's second, uh, volume in his biography, The Old Chieftain. I'm going to get into Confederation more there, but a major development leading up to Confederation is the coalition government, where George Brown and John A. Macdonald buried the hatchet and formed a coalition government in the United Province of Canada. And this coalition government was the government that both went to Charlottetown and led the push for Confederation. And this burying of the hatchet between Brown and Macdonald in the coalition government was a major accomplishment, demonstrating a liberality in both Brown and Macdonald. And I personally find the United Province of Canada assembly and these politicians of this period to be really exemplary. Both Brown and Macdonald's. I don't know enough about Blake, but the fact that they, in the end, resolved their differences and formed a coalition government that resulted in confederation and the country that you know eventually built the Canadian Pacific Railway and extended to the Pacific Ocean. It's quite the I think the United Province of Canada and these figures are really exemplary as figures of democracy, um, not only for Canada, but for the greater world. I've been describing these complex situations in the assembly where you have French-speaking members, democratically elected, of course, English-speaking Protestants, radical, um, um, you know, evangelical Protestants, Irish Catholics, um, more old school Church of England Tories. This is an incredibly complicated situation. And the fact that they sat in the same assembly and passed laws and eventually formed a coalition government that formed Canada as a federation I think, is a real gold mine for anybody interested in how, or just an example of democracy. In I really do think that period is, and it's well documented in the old school University of Toronto historians. Of course, those being Harold Innes, Donald Creighton, JMS Careless, Morton. I refer also to Donald Swainson's biography. Donald Swainson, I think, was from Manitoba, but I'm not sure, but don't quote me on that. But Donald Swainson's biography, I make a few references to at the end here as some means of comparison to Creigton's biography. And obviously, Creigton's biography is something of the classical account of John A. Macdonald. Certainly is not read nowadays, but quote, "We will be British Americans," unquote. That's John A. Macdonald, September 12, 1864. We will be British Americans, not Nova Scotians or New Brunswickers or Canadians, which Canadians originally meant, well, first of all, French Canadians. The Americans in the 13 colonies would have used the word Canadian to refer to the French in New France. And then in this period, in the United Province of Canada, Canadian meant Upper and Lower Canada. In the context leading up to Confederation, that's what a Canadian meant to New Brunswickers and Nova Scotians as people from Upper and Lower Canada, and which were smashed together by Lord Durham into one province, the United Province of Canada. But Macdonald didn't identify as a Canadian there. He says in 1864, we will be British Americans. British Americans. This is how he identified. Macdonald also wanted Canada to be, after Confederation, to be called the Kingdom of Canada. So his Kingston roots, although he was Scottish, he was very British in his identity, or British American is how he describes himself. Joseph Howe, the Nova Scotia Democrat, also had a real strong British Empire connection, but his conception was more the, quote, ships, colonies, and commerce, maritime British Empire, whereas Macdonald, being more in the interior, had a greater pull to the continental economy, while still politically conceiving himself in a strong British light. I will leave most of the Confederation debate and lead up to the second volume, but George Brown and Macdonald and Galt, who was the English speaker from Quebec, Eastern Townships, was also a major figure in Confederation from the United Province of Canada, really led the charge for Confederation and convinced the Maritimers. And Macdonald goes to Britain, to London, the seat of empire, numerous times. He went when he was younger too, but he goes over in the build up to Confederation. Macdonald had, according to Creigton, quote, had the conservatives' feeling for historical continuity, unquote. English-speaking minority in Quebec always looked to Galt of Sherbrooke as its leader. And Macdonald, I think Galt was an independent in the United Province of Canada that Macdonald and maybe Brown, I'm not sure, brought into the coalition government that sought Confederation. So hopefully I've given a good picture, especially by these anecdotes. People can get a sense of Johnny Macdonald's personality. But just to, Swainson has a few comments that also give us a bit of a more distant but summarizing view of Macdonald. This is from Sir John A. Macdonald, The Man and the Politician, by Donald Swainson, published 1989. Macdonald had a love of reading, an industrious nature. Macdonald read widely in history, law, and literature. He was always reading, apparently. At times, Macdonald would retreat and drink heavily. He had a caustic tongue and vicious temper, a debating expert in the use of the quick retort and piercing question. His tastes, his wife's medical condition, and travel meant he was always in debt. This played a part in the tension for which he drank. He was a coalition builder, not an adamant ideologue. He drank when times tough, as if to spite events and fate. Macdonald was easygoing, a bon vivant. A few famous quotes of Macdonald's. He said to D'Arcy McGee, the Irish-Canadian political leader who he had in the cabinet, I believe, after Confederation, but D'Arcy McGee was assassinated by, I believe, by Irish Republicans or maybe Irish American sympathizers. In any case, he said D'Arcy McGee drank and so Macdonald says in a famous quote, he says, quote, "McGee, no cabinet can stand two drunkards in it, and you have to stop," unquote. Another famous quote, which I'm going to quote from my own book, which I'm going to put a link for in the chat to give a plug to myself, because I'm frigging broke. So I'm going to put a link to my book in the quote, in which I have this quote of Sir John A. Macdonald's. Hopefully I can do that, for heaven's sake. Give me a break, quote. Enable chat. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Can't create a link in the chat? Gotta fix that. Huh. Well. I don't seem to have the chat working, which is unfortunate because I'm hoping to develop a conversation with viewers. But I have a quote here from my book of Sir John, or John A. Macdonald's. One of his more famous quotes, he says, responding to a heckler, quote, "Yes, but the people would prefer John A. drunk to George Brown sober," unquote. One of his more famous quotes. This is my book, available on Amazon, detailing 4 or 5 periods looking at this complex dynamic in liberal democracies between parties, more looking at from the perspective of the current dysfunction in Canada and the US, just looking at liberal democracy and the party system in previous periods, one of which is British North America. And this is why I have a little bit on the Assembly in the United Province of Canada. Yes, once again, the amazing pre-Confederation coalition government of Macdonald, Brown, Cartier, McGee, and Alexander Galt. This, for people from the completely dysfunctional 21st century, politically speaking, we need to read this history of previous periods of liberal democracies and understand that there's no dualism in this incredibly complicated situation, where there was compromise, coalitions, um, much more direct democracy of members voting according to what their constituents or what they personally believed in. Individual personalities, not party uniformity and sheep like behavior. Conservative and liberal Conservatives and liberals working together supremely demonstrated in the coalition government of the province of Canada that went to Charlottetown in 1864 and produced Confederation. So just a few notes on Creigton's sources and on some secondary sources he recommends. This is obviously the venerable University of Toronto professor, and his methods of historical writing are stringently primary source based. Most of the primary sources on Macdonald are in the Public Archives of Canada, especially the bound portfolios of the Macdonald papers. Creigton is quoting continuously from Macdonald's own letters, and these are in the Macdonald papers in the Public Archives of Canada. He also quotes from primary documents in the correspondences between the Governor Generals in Canada and the Colonial Office in Britain. These are known as the dispatches, or the G series, state papers of the Colonial Secretary and the Governor General of Canada. He quotes from the minutes of the Executive Council's pre-Confederation, but there was no Hansard pre-Confederation. He quotes from documents in the Public Records Office in Britain, the Carnarvon Papers. That was one of the main colonial secretaries leading up to Confederation. Secondary sources that he quotes from, well, once again, primary sources, his notes are filled with newspapers, speeches of politicians is quoted in newspapers. In those days, the newspapers would run the full speeches of the politicians in the newspaper, which demonstrates a much more intellectual society than the newspapers now. And there's still some decent newspapers, but for them to reprint entire speeches by politicians, they would assume that this would be too boring and long for any reader to read nowadays, which is not very complimentary to the 21st century reader. But this, the papers, I won't list the actual papers that he quotes from, but they're in Kingston, Montreal, Toronto. Some of the secondary sources that Creigton quotes from: the previous memoir, or biography, I should say, of Macdonald by Joseph Pope, Memoirs of the Right Honourable Sir John Alexander Macdonald, first Prime Minister of the Dominion of Canada, London, 1894. He quotes from this. So if he quotes from it, it must have been something of an authority up until the 1950s. He also quotes quite a bit from J.P. Macpherson's biography of Macdonald, Life of the Right Honourable Sir John A. Macdonald, St. John, 1891. That's J.P. Macpherson, Life of the Right Honourable Sir John A. Macdonald, along with Joseph Pope's biography. Other secondary sources. he quotes to such a large extent from primary sources that there's hardly any secondary sources in here, which tells you something about Creigton's, once again, his methodology of writing history, which is hard to criticize. I mean, he excludes things conspicuously. There's very little reference to the indigenous peoples in this biography. Now, the extent to which this was an indication of the small population of indigenous peoples in Upper Canada, where specifically where John A. Macdonald was from, the extent to which that's the case, I'm not sure. I don't think that excuses Macdonald or Creigton from the general lack of attention paid to the indigenous peoples. However, just to relate the numbers that we're talking about here, to put this apparent, and I'd have to say evident, indifference of Macdonald and Creigton to indigenous peoples. Donald Smith has some numbers. Of course, Smith is critical of John A. Macdonald's indifference or lack of attention paid to native peoples. But the numbers here, we're talking about several hundred Mississauga indigenous people at the eastern end of Lake Ontario. And when Macdonald's family arrived there in 1815, of course, these percentages would have even increased or separated even more so after 1815. We're talking about 260 Mississauga in the area and 17,000, British residents. So even if we round this up to about 400, because he says several hundred, but later he breaks that down to literally 260. We're talking about, even if we go up to 400, several hundred Mississauga, we're talking about 2% of the population in Macdonald's local area. Now, further on into the 19th century, that percentage is just going to decrease further. So this is not to explain away the indifference of or lack of attention of Macdonald and Creigton to the indigenous peoples, but those numbers are Macdonald did not have much interaction with native peoples until much later in his career, when the railway was put across the prairie provinces. Then he is open to some criticism because he did have portfolio responsibility over things touching on native people, and the numbers and there's more reason to criticize him later in his career in his local area in Kingston, and in his early political career. Not to say there was no reason to criticize him, but there was less than later in his career, when he had ministerial portfolio over the Department of Indian Affairs or the Interior or whatever it was. He had portfolios including interaction with native peoples. But Smith also relates in his early career, there was one major piece of legislation that he passed in the United Province of Canada. So to extrapolate those numbers across the United Province of Canada, Smith says that in the early 1850s, there was 15,000 Indigenous people in the United Province of Canada and a population of 2 million. That's even a smaller percentage than in Macdonald's local area. It's not even 1% of the population. It's 0.0075% of the population. Now, that is not to say that the legal rights of the Indigenous peoples should have been any different than any of the other residents of the United Province of Canada. Of course, more so given that they've been there for 10,000 years. Although the Iroquois were not native to Ontario, and the Mississauga were, I believe, but the Iroquois were came from New York State after the Revolution, but the Huron were the native Indigenous peoples to Ontario, but they were wiped out by the Iroquois. So Ontario is this particular situation. Once again, the criticism of Macdonald later in his political career is more applicable. I think I could generalize to say, but Smith notes one major piece of legislation Macdonald passed or was instrumental in passing was the Gradual Civilization Act, which Smith characterizes as a policy of assimilation. However, in his more detailed description of it, it's not quite that, the intentions were not, don't appear to be quite that serious. So Smith relates that in May 1857, the member from Kingston rose in the Assembly to introduce one of the most important bills in the history of Canadian Indian policy, namely the Act for the Gradual Civilization of the Indian Tribes in the Canadas. Neither Macdonald nor any other cabinet member consulted any chiefs or Indian councils prior to the legislative debate. So that's a significant piece of information. The Gradual Civilization Act, the precursor of the Post-Confederation Indian Act of 1867, established the procedures by which status Indians could become enfranchised or full citizens. The Act granted Indians the right to vote, the full rights of British subject, and the ownership of 20 hectares or 50 acres of reserve land, the common size for a viable farm in central Canada. Any Indian adult male judged by a special board of examiners to be educated, free of debt, and of good moral character could apply. After a successful 3-year trial period, the applicant gained full ownership of his 50 acres, which immediately ceased to be part of the reserve. It became theirs and could be sold to a non-Indian. As enfranchised Indians acquired individual portions of land or sold their land to other buyers, it was intended that the reserves would gradually disappear as the part of the normal flow of progress. So, the act is called the Gradual Civilization Act, but in the context of an Indigenous person acquiring private property that is some means to make a living and own property, that's not necessarily a exclusion from civilization, as if the assimilation was to exclude them in some way. It's more inclusive, but the Gradual Civilization Act, in a negative light, that it looks like assimilation, and in a positive light, that these same parts of the legislation are allowing participation in the modern economy, but the lack of consultation of Indigenous peoples is certainly inexcusable. I'm just presenting two sides to this. Also, I'll reiterate the legal case that Macdonald took when he was younger. That's quite in the murder trial of the Mohawk defendant accused of murder. The Gradual Civilization Act passed with only one dissenting vote, that of William Lyon Mackenzie. That's the rebel leader from the rebellions of 1837. As to why he voted against it, I'm not sure. You might say in the note here, but I'm not going to look at that. In his early political career, Macdonald on at least one occasion worked for recognition of a First Nations treaty right. Just a month and a half after the passage of the Gradual Civilization Act as Attorney General of Upper Canada, Macdonald gave his legal opinion on Treaty 22, the British Agreement of 1820 with the Mississauga. When consulted that summer, Macdonald stated that these lands were not an outright purchase, but instead a surrender in trust to the government, and consequently the profits of the land until sold and the amount of money received on sale of any portion of it must be expended for the benefit of the Indians. The profits of the land until sold and the amount of money received on sale of any portion of it must be expended for the benefit of the Indians according to the terms of the trust. So this is a positive interpretation of the treaty for Indigenous peoples. As Attorney General, he ruled that the Canadian government must fulfill its trust agreement to reimburse the Mississauga for land acquired by the Crown in Treaty 22. Indigenous issues occupied little of John A. Macdonald's attention after 1857, onward to the Confederation debates. The index to the printed volume of his letters includes only two references between 1858 and 1861. This suggests that politicians were convinced that the Indian question in the Canadas was over. The passage of the Gradual Civilization Act provided the solution, namely the assimilation of the First Nations. And as for whether a viewer or anyone wants to interpret that in a positive or negative light, that's up for debate. I'm not. I'm just relating, evidence here, and people can interpret and draw their own conclusions on John A. Macdonald in this important respect. Creigton, vast preponderance of primary sources. There's some early sources on Macdonald from his childhood years. A Toronto newspaper called The Patriot. It's not something we usually associate with Toronto, but it's interesting. It's more of an American phrase, obviously. JMS Careless, quote, "Who was George Brown?" question mark, unquote. Ontario History, Volume 52, April 1950. And then Careless wrote a 2-volume biography on Brown, but that's probably related in the second volume. I would like to research George Brown more too. A major conclusion of this, looking at these two, Macdonald and his arch enemy George Brown, is that they formed a coalition government that resulted in Canada. This is not known much, especially in this 21st century. We've got these ridiculous Republican and Democrat uh, bifurcation. I believe Macdonald challenged him. Macdonald and Brown definitely came to blows at a certain in a certain debate in the Assembly of the United Province of Canada. They came to blows. I don't think he challenged Brown to a duel, although he may have. I have to go look at that anecdote again. But um, they came to physical blows at one point. Macdonald accused Brown of he had harbored an interpretation, a grudge against Brown for something many years before. And he accused him of something about some commission Brown had sat on. And Macdonald thought that he had falsified evidence and other things. And at a certain point, Brown was ticking him off. He got up and just exploded on Brown with all these accusations. And I believe they came to blows or possibly a duel. These two guys formed a coalition government that resulted in confederation. If those two guys can act like that, well, our politicians today have a lot to learn from this period and from these kind of politicians who you'd have to say are something of a statesman. And on that note, I will end this first volume, and I will have a second video for the second volume of Creigton's biography. The Old Chieftain is John A. Macdonald is only just getting going at this point. So I'll see you then.